The day I arrived at my son's house in Flagstaff, I was greeted with a smile, a kiss on the cheek, and a gentle pat on the back. Warm enough on the surface, but 10 minutes later, I was standing at the top of the basement stairs, holding my suitcase, staring down into a dark space that smelled like old paint and concrete dust. My daughter-in-law said it was temporary. My son said it was quiet and private. They both said it like they had rehearsed it, and I said nothing. But deep inside, something had already shifted, not anger, not yet, just a quiet sense that I had arrived somewhere I was not meant to stay. After 35 years of working as a school accountant and 2 long years of widowhood, I sold the little house in Oklahoma where my husband and I had raised our only son. It was time, I thought. Time to stop being alone, time to feel needed again. So I packed up my life, hired a moving service for the few boxes I kept, and bought a one-way bus ticket to Flagstaff. My son Mason had said it would be great to have me stay for a while. His wife Heather even texted a thumbs-up emoji. That was enough for me to believe it was a good idea. The bus ride was long but oddly comforting. I watched the flat plains turn into hills and then mountains. I imagined breakfast on their back patio, helping with my granddaughter's school projects, maybe even cooking Sunday dinners again. My chest felt full in a good way. I hadn't felt that kind of warmth in a long time. Mason met me at the station. He looked tired but happy. We hugged, he took my bag, and made a little joke about how I hadn't aged a day. I laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from relief more than amusement. Their house was beautiful, 2 stories, clean white trim, well-kept front yard. I noticed a new SUV in the driveway and a set of wind chimes near the porch that made the softest sound. For a moment, I let myself believe I was truly coming home. But when we stepped inside, Heather barely looked up from her laptop. She smiled thinly and gestured toward the hallway. Mason picked up my suitcase again and said, "Follow me, Mom." His voice had a tone I didn't recognize, almost distracted, almost rehearsed. He led me down a flight of stairs at the back of the house. The air grew cooler with each step. The basement had one hanging bulb, a twin mattress on a metal frame, and a folding chair in the corner next to the washing machine. I stood there for a moment, hands on the strap of my purse, and tried to make sense of what this meant. Mason said the upstairs was being renovated. Heather said the basement had great privacy. I nodded. I didn't want to seem ungrateful. That night, I lay on the mattress, listening to the water heater hum. The ceiling was low, the room smelled like laundry and damp carpet. I closed my eyes and reminded myself I was here to be with family, but something about the silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt like being erased, quietly, efficiently, as if I had stepped out of my old life and into a shadow of someone else's. You're listening from, and if any part of this story sounds like something you've lived through yourself. The mattress was thin, the kind that creaks when you shift even slightly. I lay still, hands folded across my chest, staring at the unfinished beams above me. There was no ceiling, just pipes and wires crossing like veins. The one exposed light bulb in the corner buzzed quietly, its chain pull swaying ever so slightly each time the furnace kicked on. There was no window, no clock, and no sound of life upstairs, just the steady low thrum of appliances and the faraway drip of a pipe that had probably leaked for years. I told myself it was temporary, just a week, maybe 2. Maybe it was easier for them this way, maybe they really were remodeling the upstairs. I didn't need much, a bed, a blanket, a little piece of stillness. Something about being shown to a basement without a word of hesitation stayed with me like a thin splinter under the skin. Not painful at first, just there. Dinner that night had been quiet. Heather made a salad and some kind of quinoa bake. Mason scrolled through his phone during most of the meal. Their daughter, Molly, barely looked up from her tablet. I tried asking her about school, but Heather cut in and said she was focusing on screen-free time. Then she turned to Molly and reminded her to finish her vegetables. That was the end of that. When I brought my plate to the sink, Heather waved me off. She said they had a system that everyone cleaned their own things, so I rinsed my plate, wiped it down, and placed it where I thought it belonged. Heather watched me as if I had crossed a line I couldn't see. Later that night, I crept upstairs to get a glass of water. The house was dark. From the hallway, I could hear their voices behind the closed door of their bedroom. At first, It was a low murmur. Then Mason's voice, louder, said he was exhausted and needed space. Heather responded quieter but with sharpness in her tone, something about boundaries, something about pressure. I stood frozen for a moment, then backed away. I didn't want to hear more. Back in the basement, I sat on the edge of the mattress, glass in hand. I stared at the door at the top of the stairs. It had a small lock turned inward. I hadn't noticed that before. I didn't know if it had always been there or if someone had turned it after I came back down. That night, I didn't sleep much. My body ached from the drive, but more than that, something inside me had started to ache in a different way. I had told myself I came here to feel connected again, to feel useful, but instead, for the first time in a long while, I felt invisible. And maybe worse than invisible, I felt unnecessary, a piece of old furniture they didn't want to throw away yet, just tucked out of sight until it was convenient. By the third morning, I had settled into a quiet routine. I woke before everyone else, tiptoed upstairs to make coffee, and sat on the back porch until I heard footsteps above. Then I'd slide back down into the basement as if I had not been there. Ever been there? It was easier that way. That morning, Heather caught me rinsing a few dishes in the sink. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. Her expression did the talking, polite but clipped. She stood with her arms folded, her perfectly manicured fingers tapping against her elbow. She said they had a system, everyone cleaned their own things. She used the word boundaries again. I nodded, dried my hands, and stepped aside. Later, I overheard her telling Mason that I was making her feel crowded, that maybe it was time to talk about expectations. I tried to stay out of the way. I took out the trash, helped Molly with her spelling, and folded laundry. No one asked me to fold, but the more I did, the more uncomfortable Heather seemed, like any small gesture was some kind of intrusion. That afternoon, I offered to cover groceries for the week. It felt like the right thing to do. Mason smiled and thanked me. Heather said nothing. A few hours later, she slid a printed list across the kitchen island. It was typed, itemized, and totaled down to the cent. There was a line at the bottom labeled optional support, roof repair $8,000. I stared at the number, then at the note beside it. In parentheses, she had written, not urgent but appreciated. I folded the paper and slipped it into my bag. No one mentioned it again. That night, over dinner, Heather brought up school supplies. Molly needed a new laptop for the upcoming semester, something reliable, maybe around $1,200. Mason added that the brakes on his car were acting up again, another $600, maybe more. He looked tired when he said it. He didn't ask outright, but he didn't have to. I nodded and said I'd help with what I could. They both smiled, but Heather's smile didn't reach her eyes. After the meal, I went to clear the table. Heather stepped in and said they'd handle it. She handed me a wine glass and gestured toward the patio. I stood out there in the cool air, listening through the screen door as they spoke softly inside. Heather's voice, calm and flat, said she thought I'd catch on faster. Mason said to give it time. She said the basement was working for now, but they'd have to move quicker if they wanted the rest. I didn't know what that meant, not yet, but a part of me, the part that had learned to listen without interrupting, to smile even when my chest tightened, that part started to understand. I was being handled, positioned like someone moving a chess piece, not with cruelty, not even with anger, just quiet, controlled distance. And for the first time, I realized that all the politeness, the careful phrasing, the soft tones, they weren't kindness, they were strategy. The next week unfolded in small, quiet requests. At first, they were subtle, a text from Heather with a grocery list, a reminder from Mason that Molly's school fundraiser was coming up and they needed to buy raffle tickets, then a car repair estimate placed neatly on the counter. No one asked directly, but every slip of paper had the same weight behind it. I told myself it was fine. Helping your child was normal. I had the money, at least enough to manage these small things, and it felt easier than saying no. But something about the rhythm of it all made me uneasy. It wasn't the amount, it was the way it came, always gentle, always sandwiched between friendly smiles and vague compliments, as if I wouldn't notice that every kind word was followed by a dollar sign. I paid for the school fundraiser. I left cash in an envelope for the car repair. I handed Heather a check when she mentioned their home insurance renewal. Each time she said thank you with the same expression she used when tipping a barista: quick, polite, forgettable. It didn't stop there. One afternoon, while folding towels, I overheard Mason on the phone. His voice was soft, but the wall vent carried every word. He was explaining that they had support from family now, that they could manage the next payment, that his mother was staying for a while and it was working out. I didn't know who he was talking to, but I knew what it meant. I was no longer a guest, I was a resource. That evening, Heather sent me a message with a link to a budgeting spreadsheet she had set up. It included line items labeled household contribution, shared utilities, and grocery adjustments. The totals were precise. My name was in the corner of the document. I sat with it for a long time. Then I closed the screen and said nothing. Instead, I made dinner: roast chicken, garlic mashed potatoes, salad with fresh vinaigrette, the kind of meal that takes your mind off numbers. Mason said it reminded him of when he was a kid. Heather didn't say much but had 2 servings. Molly smiled for the first time that week. Later, Heather texted again. This time it was a Venmo request for $800, labeled simply monthly balance. I stared at it. The chicken hadn't even cooled in the fridge, and already I was back to being a line item. I didn't reply. That night, lying in the dark, I did the math in my head. Since I arrived, I had contributed nearly $3,000, not all at once, not in a dramatic way, just slowly, quietly, like a leak in a roof you don't notice until the ceiling caves in. They hadn't taken advantage of me with force, they did it with grace, with well-timed silence, with the kind of charm that doesn't leave bruises, just a hollow space where trust used to be. It was just past 9 when I stepped into the kitchen that night. The house was dark except for a soft glow from under Mason and Heather's bedroom door. I moved quietly, the way I always did, careful not to disturb whatever system they had in place. I only wanted a glass of water, but when I passed the hallway vent, I heard my name. Their door wasn't fully shut, just slightly ajar, enough for sound to slip through. Heather's voice was calm but deliberate. She said they needed to make a decision soon, that the house wouldn't stay in her name unless they acted fast. Mason responded with something about timing. He said they had to be subtle, that pushing too hard might backfire. Heather cut in again, firmer. Time, she said. I wouldn't be around forever. I stood there frozen. The words landed slowly like drops of cold water. They weren't fighting, they weren't whispering. This wasn't an argument, it was a strategy meeting. I stepped back into the shadows and pressed my back against the wall. My hand trembled slightly around the glass. They were talking about the house, my house, the one I helped them get almost 2 decades ago. When Mason's credit was in ruins after that business loan default, the mortgage had been filed under my name. At the time, I had told myself it was temporary, they would refinance when things stabilized. But it had never happened, and I had never pushed. Now I realized that silence had cost me more than I thought. The next morning, I waited until they had left for work. I pulled out the folder I kept tucked in the bottom of my suitcase. Inside were copies of the original mortgage documents. My name was still there, clear as day, no transfer, no amendment, no signature giving anything away. I stared at the papers, remembering the day Mason had signed them with shaky hands, remembering how grateful he had been, how proud I had felt believing I had given him a chance to build something solid. And now, listening to that late-night conversation, I understood just how far I had fallen from the center of that story. I wasn't family, I was paperwork. I was a signature waiting to be used. When Heather came home that afternoon, she was all smiles. She asked if I wanted to help plan Molly's birthday party, said they were thinking of a backyard barbecue. I nodded, smiled back, and told her I'd love to help. Later, when no one was looking, I slipped the folder back into my suitcase and zipped it shut. This time, I left the zipper handle facing outward, easy to reach, not because I planned to run, but because I knew the door to this chapter was no longer open. It had been left ajar, just enough for the truth to slip through, just enough for me to see what they truly thought. And from now on, I would keep both eyes open. That night, I couldn't sleep. The air in the basement felt heavier than usual, like the room itself knew something had shifted. I sat on the edge of the mattress, listening to the hum of the water heater, the faint creak of the pipes. I wasn't crying, I wasn't angry. I felt something quieter than all that, a kind of stillness that sits right at the edge of disbelief. I had replayed their voices in my head all day, the way Heather said it so easily, so casually, that I wouldn't be around forever, as if I were a placeholder, as if my name on the house was just an obstacle they were waiting to outlive. I had given that house to them in good faith, not because I had to, but because I believed in what we were building as a family. I had always believed that sacrifice was what mothers did. You give so your children can climb, you step aside so they can take the lead. But no one tells you what to do when they forget to look back. In the early morning, I stood in the center of the basement. I looked around. The walls were unfinished, rough with old drywall. In one corner, a faded chalk line ran along the cement where Mason had drawn when he was a boy. It was still there, a little taller than my hip, a date written in smudged red crayon. That was the year he turned 11, the year he broke his arm falling out of a tree and cried in my arms for an hour straight. I ran my fingers along that line and felt something crack open inside me, not pain exactly, something closer to recognition. I wasn't just some woman staying in their house, this had been my home once. My name built it, my hands helped lay the tile in the kitchen, my paycheck kept the lights on when they were starting out. That basement had been a playroom, a storage room, a place where Mason once whispered his dreams into the floorboards. Now it was a holding cell, and I had let it happen. I let it happen one smile at a time, one quiet nod, one check written without a second glance, not because I was foolish, but because I wanted to believe that love would be enough. That morning, I made coffee like usual, but I didn't drink it. I sat at the kitchen table while the house was still silent, the sun had barely risen. Heather's carefully labeled jars gleamed in the window light, and Mason's keys rested in their usual bowl by the fridge. I looked around and saw not a home but a set, every item in its place, every word rehearsed, every moment shaped for convenience. It had been a long time since I felt like someone's mother here, even longer since I felt like someone's guest. What I felt now was something else entirely. I felt like a threat, and I knew what came next, not the fight, not yet. First came the smile, then the ask, then the paper, and this time I would be ready. By the end of that week, something inside me had gone very quiet, not empty, not broken, just quiet in the way a door finally closes when you stop waiting for it to swing back open. They didn't notice the change. I still made coffee in the morning, still offered to pick up groceries, still helped Molly with her spelling drills, still nodded and smiled when Heather mentioned how tight things were getting. But I had started paying attention in a different way, not to what they said, but to what they didn't. They didn't ask how I was sleeping, they didn't ask if I was comfortable, they didn't ask how I felt about the budgeting spreadsheet or the Venmo requests, and they didn't ask if I ever missed having a home of my own. They assumed I didn't because they assumed I had nowhere else to go. That assumption was their first mistake. The second was thinking I had no fight left in me. One morning, after they left for work, I pulled out the folder again. I laid everything flat on the table, mortgage statements, property tax records, the original deed dated and notarized, my name, my handwriting, the signature that sealed it all. I took photos of every page and backed them up to a flash drive. Then I tucked the originals back into the folder, slid it into my suitcase, and I didn't plan on leaving yet, but I wanted to be ready. Next, I called a lawyer, not a big firm, just an old colleague of my husband's from back when we refinanced the house. He remembered me and asked how I was holding up. I said I was fine, but I wasn't calling for small talk. I was calling to ask what it would take to reclaim legal control of a property still under my name. His voice turned serious. He asked a few questions, then he said it wouldn't take much at all. I thanked him, wrote down everything he said, and folded the paper into my wallet. That night, I cleaned the kitchen after everyone had gone to bed. I scrubbed the sink, wiped the counters, and stacked the dishwasher. Then I turned out the light and stood in the dark for a few minutes, letting my eyes adjust, listening to the silence upstairs. Not the kind of silence that invites rest, but the kind that grows when people think no one's watching. Back in the basement, I took out a notebook and began to write. Nothing dramatic, just a list, what I had paid for since arriving, what I still had in my account, and what steps would follow if I needed to act. It felt good to put it on paper, to see the numbers, to know I hadn't imagined the shift in tone or the slow extraction of my boundaries. I didn't write it out of anger. I wrote it because facts matter when everything else starts to feel slippery. And that was the thing I had been missing, not comfort, not even kindness, but control. Little by little, I was taking it back. Heather invited me to tea on a Wednesday morning. She said she had a break between yoga clients and thought we could catch up. She smiled in that polished way she had, the kind that looked sincere if you didn't watch closely. I agreed without hesitation. By then, I already knew what this was. She set the table on the back patio with care, floral napkins, matching cups, and a small tray of lemon cookies from the bakery downtown. The tea was hot, steeped just right. She poured mine first, then hers, then sat down and folded her hands. We talked for a few minutes about Molly's reading scores and how the school was pushing more tech-based learning. She mentioned the rising cost of groceries, the state of the market, and how interest rates were tightening again. It was all warm-up. I knew that rhythm well. You lead with small concerns so the ask feels less sharp when it lands. Then it came. She slid a manila envelope across the table, neatly labeled. Inside was a stack of forms, financial disclosures, refinance applications, and a pre-filled authorization for full financial control of the property. She didn't call it that, of course. She used words like streamline and simplify. She said this would help the household function more smoothly, that it would lift the stress from everyone's shoulders. I stirred my tea gently, letting the spoon click once against the porcelain. Then I looked her in the eye and told her no. Not in anger, not even coldly, just clearly. She blinked, then tried again. She said Mason had been so stressed, said this. It was just a formality, something that could make their lives easier. I told her I believed her, and that I also believed she was hoping I would keep doing what I always did, smile, nod, sign. But this time I wouldn't. I reached into my purse and pulled out a copy of the deed, not the original, just the copy I kept for this moment. I placed it on top of her folder. She looked down, and for the first time since I arrived, Heather had nothing to say. I told her they had 30 days, that I would be reclaiming the property, and that she and Mason would need to find new housing. I said it softly, no threats, no raised voice, just facts. She stared at me, then at the tea now cooling in front of her. Her posture changed, not slumped, just less polished. She picked up the envelope, stood, and walked back into the house without another word. I stayed outside a few more minutes, sipping tea that had long since gone cold. The sun had shifted slightly, casting a longer shadow across the patio. I let it fall over me and closed my eyes. It didn't feel like victory, it felt like a breath I had been holding since the day I arrived, and now finally I could exhale. Mason found me in the kitchen the next morning. He walked in already tense, holding a folder thick with papers. He didn't say good morning, he didn't ask how I slept. He placed the folder on the counter and slid it toward me. I didn't touch it. He said Heather had told him what happened on the patio, that I had misunderstood, that they were only trying to secure the future of the household, that I was blowing things out of proportion. His voice was low but tight, like he was trying hard to hold something in. I waited until he finished, then I told him I hadn't misunderstood anything. He looked at me the way someone looks when they realize the road they've chosen doesn't lead where they thought it would. Then he raised his voice, said I had betrayed him, that I was pulling the rug out from under his family, that this house was more theirs than mine. I stayed quiet for a moment, then I opened a drawer and pulled out an envelope I had prepared the night before. Inside was a detailed list of every payment I had made since I arrived. Dates, amounts, categories, not for guilt, not for drama, just for clarity. I laid it on the counter beside his folder. He didn't open it. I told him I had once signed the mortgage papers to help him build a life, that I had stood by him through bad credit, job losses, and late nights when he didn't know what to do next. I reminded him that when the bank called, I picked up. When collectors showed up, I answered the door. But I also told him that helping someone doesn't mean disappearing for them, that support doesn't mean silence, and that being a mother doesn't mean becoming a resource. He didn't respond, just stared down at the folder like it might save him. I told him 30 days wasn't a punishment, it was a boundary, that I wasn't asking for anything back, I wasn't taking revenge. I was just stepping out of a role I never agreed to. Forever, I said I would continue to help where it made sense. I would still be there for Molly in the ways that mattered, but I would not continue funding their life while being treated like a silent investor with no name. He finally looked at me, then really looked. There was no fire in his face, no rage, just something quieter, something tired. He nodded once, picked up the folder, and walked out. I didn't cry, I didn't shake. I poured a cup of coffee, took it to the table, and sat down. As the sun came through the window, the kitchen felt different that morning. Still quiet, still full of routines, but now I was in control of what happened next, and that, for the first time in a long while, felt like enough. Mason didn't speak to me for 2 days. Not in anger, not in protest, just silence. The kind of silence that fills a house without making a sound. It moved through the hallways and sat in every room like fog. Heather acted like nothing had changed. She still left her empty smoothie cups on the counter, still tapped away on her laptop with the same air of preoccupation, still spoke in that even voice that never wavered, even when she was displeased. I saw the glances she gave Mason, short, sharp ones. He never looked back. On the third morning, I found him in the garage. The door was open, and he was standing near the workbench, staring at a pile of old extension cords. He wasn't doing anything, just standing, shoulder slumped in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. I stood in the doorway. Neither of us said a word at first. Then he asked how long I had planned all of it. I didn't answer, not because I was avoiding the question, but because I didn't think it mattered. He said he thought I came there to be with family. I told him I had, that I still believed in the idea of family, just not in a version where care only went in one direction. He nodded once, not in agreement, not even in understanding, just acknowledgement, a small, tired motion. Then he said something I hadn't expected. He said he knew what they had done, that the asking, the pressure, the slow erosion of boundaries had gone too far. He said it without apology, just fact. His voice was steady, flat. I didn't feel triumphant, I didn't feel justified. I felt something like grief, the kind that comes when you realize a person you love has finally seen what you saw all along, but only after everything is already changed. I told him I wasn't leaving because I stopped loving them, I was leaving because I had started loving myself again. That line didn't land with any grand effect. He didn't flinch, he didn't push back. We stood there for another minute before I turned to go. As I walked back toward the house, I heard him say one last thing. He said he had always thought I would outlast them all, that I'd always be there. I didn't stop walking, but I did take that in. I carried it with me through the kitchen, down the stairs, and into the basement that never felt like mine. He hadn't apologized, he hadn't tried to make it right, but for the first time he had spoken without spinning it, no excuse, no performance, just the weight of what he finally understood. And maybe that was the only part of him I had been waiting for, the part that knew I had been there all along, even when he wasn't looking. It wasn't closure, it wasn't healing, but it was honest, and for now, that would do. The night before I left, I packed my suitcase in silence. It didn't take long. Most of what I brought had stayed folded in the same place. I had only unpacked what I needed, and even then, only enough to get by. It struck me how little I had used, how little I had taken up space. The basement felt heavier than usual, even with the lights on. I moved slowly, folding each shirt with care, lining up my shoes, zipping compartments without hurry. There was no sadness in my hands, no bitterness either, just steadiness, the kind you build when you finally stop waiting for something to change. I left the sheets folded at the foot of the bed, clean, smoothed out the way I had found them when I arrived. Upstairs, the house was quiet. No one came to say goodnight. Mason had stayed in the garage most of the evening, Heather had gone into their room early, and Molly had spent the afternoon at a friend's house. It was a clean break, no speech, no scene. I placed a sealed envelope on the kitchen counter before I went to bed. Inside was a handwritten letter. I didn't dramatize anything, I didn't list wrongs, I didn't write to explain. I wrote to say goodbye. I told them I wished them well. I told them I hoped they would learn to love without needing control. And I told them, most of all, that I was choosing peace, that I wasn't walking away in anger. I was walking away because I had finally remembered how to walk on my own. The next morning, I left before sunrise. The air outside was cool, still holding the quiet of night. I rolled my suitcase across the driveway, the wheels clicked against the concrete. I didn't look back at the house, there was nothing left to see. The cab driver was kind, he didn't ask questions, just helped me with my bag and kept the radio low as we pulled away. I looked down at my hands resting in my lap. For the first time in a long while, they felt empty in a good way, not waiting to give, not bracing to hold, just resting. I didn't know what would come next, I hadn't made a grand plan. But I had a key in my pocket to a small apartment waiting for me across town, and that was enough. Leaving wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and firm, a closing of a door that should have never been left open this long. And sometimes the strongest thing a woman can do is leave without asking anyone to notice, just pick up what is hers and go. The apartment was small, one bedroom, a modest kitchen, and a window that caught the morning light just right, the kind of light that made old things look warm again. I hung a few photos, set my books on a shelf, unpacked my dishes like I was building something that would last. There was no grand moment of arrival. Welcome party, just a deep exhale and the quiet realization that I was exactly where I chose to be. Most days, I walked to the park down the street. Some afternoons, I sat on the bench near the fountain and watched people pass, mothers with strollers, retirees feeding birds, teenagers with headphones lost in their own rhythm. And I wasn't lonely, I was just present. I joined a local community group that offered budgeting workshops for older women. Nothing fancy, just a folding table, a whiteboard, and a dozen women who reminded me of parts of myself. Some had stories heavier than mine, some had just begun to understand the cost of silence. I didn't lead the group, I just listened. Until one day, I spoke. I told them about the house, about the basement, about the moment I realized I didn't have to shrink just to be included. A few women nodded, one cried, not out of sadness, but because she knew that was enough. I wasn't trying to rebuild what I lost, I was learning to live in what I had, dignity, clarity, a voice that no longer waited for permission. Sometimes, Mason texted short updates in a neutral tone, no apology, just little attempts to stay visible. I replied when it felt right, no bitterness, no performance, just space. And that space was mine to keep. I no longer explained myself. I no longer hoped to be understood by people who had never tried to listen. What I took with me wasn't anger, it was my name, my breath, and the understanding that peace doesn't ask you to give yourself away. It simply waits for you to come home to yourself. If this story found you at a time when you needed to hear it, I hope it gave you more than just words. Maybe it reminded you of your own quiet strength. Maybe it opened a door you thought was locked. If you've ever walked away from a place that didn't see your worth, or if you're still learning how, know that you're not alone. I'd love to know what part of this story stayed with you. Let me know where it landed in your heart.